Hello, everyone. My name is Joyce Passarello, and I'm the Director of Membership here at Scholars at Risk. It's my honor to welcome you all to the Australia launch this afternoon. Before we get started, I just want to share a few standard housekeeping for how we're going to do tech on the back end. If you have any questions about tech or you're having any issues, please use the Q&A feature. You can send either to myself, to Madeline Everett, who's also listed there as a co-host. And our staff will do our best to get in touch with you quickly and help assist you through any Zoom hiccups. We are going to get started pretty quickly because I want to make sure that we remain on track, and we have a number of wonderful speakers who are going to join us today. We'll be starting our first hour in webinar mode, so there will not be any Q&A options, but our second hour is a panel and there will be a Q&A session there. And so we'll ask everyone during that session to share their questions in the chat box, and we will proceed to funnel those to speakers so that we can have a conversation. Thank you all so much again. And now I'd like to kick off our launch by introducing SARS Executive Director, Robert Quinn.
Thank you, Joyce, and good day, everyone. It's my pleasure to greet you all and to celebrate the launch of the Australia section of the Scholars at Risk Network. My deep thanks to the University of the Sunshine Coast as co-host of the launch and for agreeing to convene the section for its first 2 years. I especially want to recognize Vice Chancellor Professor Helen Bartlett, Dr. Sophia O'Brien, Dr. Ava Marie Cito, and her fantastic staff at the Office of Engagement. We would not be here without all of you. I want to thank all of the founding members of the section and their leadership and staff who have made their participation possible. And I want to thank all of today's speakers and everyone for tuning in, for sharing part of your day, for making time to care about threatened colleagues and academic freedom at home and abroad. I need also to thank publicly all the staff at Scholars at Risk. We're truly blessed to have such a smart, talented team dedicated to our common mission and to turning our best intentions into reality, including especially Madeline Flowers Everett, who was so instrumental in coordinating with many of you and your institutions, Joyce Passarello and Chelsea Blackburn Cohen. I know you'll all enjoy working with them as much as I do. If you'll indulge me, I'd like now to read to you an email that was shared with me. It says, quote, "Dear University President, I was reminded yesterday of how often university professors and students, and I suppose intellectuals more generally, become targets of human rights abuses. I thought too of the singularly important role that refugees plays in the intellectual development of our university. And then I thought with some regret, there was little chance today of equally bright professors from Algeria or Kenya or East Timor or Bosnia or any part of the world under intellectual or political threat finding their way to our campus. But I wonder if our university couldn't do more to increase the chances of this happening. If one of our dearest cherished values is academic freedom, and if we also pride ourselves on being one of the world's great universities, couldn't we make it possible for professors in exile to come to teach here, at least temporarily, at least as a first place to catch their breath and think what to do next? This isn't utopian, is it? Wouldn't it be nice if someday our university was known internationally as a place of intellectual refuge and sanctuary?" End quote. That email was written on December 1st, 1997, and it sparked the creation of what we now know as the Scholars at Risk Network. On reflecting on the events of the past few days, and in anticipation of speaking with you today, it occurred to me that that email may have been the only email sent on that date expressing concern for refugee scholars and linking them to our dearest cherished value of academic freedom. And then it occurred to me that yesterday and today, and certainly tomorrow, there will have been tens of thousands.
Thank you, Robert Quinn, and our co-hosts at Scholars at Risk for the kind introduction. My thanks also to the 14 university members of the Scholars at Risk Australia section, to you, the participants, and to all the scholars who have joined us today and who inspire us to continue this important work. I also acknowledge distinguished guests, Chancellor Robert French and Professor Adrian Stone, the executive of the SAR Australia Foundational Partners and our Scholars at Risk Network partners globally. I'm speaking to you today on Kabi Kabi country in Australia, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that each of us are meeting on today. I extend that respect to Indigenous people participating today and to the continuation of the cultural and educational practices of First Nations people. It's an honour to be here on World Humanitarian Day 2021 and celebrating the launch of the Australia section of the Scholars at Risk. The University of the Sunshine Coast is delighted to host the SAR Australia section for its first 2 years. Our university has been an active member of the SAR network over the past 4 years, and during this time we've built a SAR chapter, hosted events and engaged students to participate in SAR internships and volunteering opportunities. Since its inception, Australia universities have been involved in the support of Scholars at Risk. The new SAR Australia section will expand Australia's higher education participation in the global SAR effort and enhance national coordination of activities in support of academic freedom, university autonomy and related values. By joining SAR Australia, Australian universities, academic leaders and staff send a strong message of solidarity with scholars and institutions in situations where academic freedom is restricted and research, publication, teaching and learning are repressed. The concept of academic freedom is complex and very topical. It's been a focus of attention recently in Australia, with a national review of higher education providers undertaken by Robert French and released in 2019. In Australia, academic freedom is defined as the freedom of academic staff and students to engage in intellectual inquiry and expression, to contribute to public debate in areas of their research or study, to express opinions about their institutions, and to participate in professional or academic bodies or student associations. Institutional autonomy is highly connected to academic freedom, reflecting the responsibility that universities have as trusted sources of evidence-based knowledge, as entities that exist for the common good and for creating a better future. These values can be tested, however, when external or sometimes internal influences exert pressures on academic activities in teaching or research. It's therefore vital for us to defend the crucial, independent role that universities have in the pursuit of knowledge. Unfortunately, some actors, individual, organisational or state, will seek to silence or humiliate scholars they see as undermining their authority. This can take many forms, including the reduction of influence, threatening special or sectarian interests, contesting their ideas and beliefs, and encouraging actions they oppose. Scholars at Risk provides advocacy, monitoring and sanctuary for such scholars and students. SAR was formed to promote and defend the academic and human rights of individuals conducting their independent intellectual inquiry and service. SAR's mission is to defend the right to think, question and share ideas freely and safely, and by doing so, to expand the space in society for reason and evidence-based approaches to resolving conflicts and solving problems. SAR actively supports research and learning initiatives that make visible the violence, intimidation, wrongful persecution and imprisonment experienced by members of our global education communities. It seeks also to understand and address the causes of these repressions. The formation of the SAR Australia section today is timely for this country. You'll be hearing later from the Honourable Robert French, who has been a champion of academic freedom and free speech, and who has developed the National Model Code that Australian universities were called upon to implement last year. It reiterated the inherent obligation that higher education leaders have to promote and foster a culture of academic freedom, and to ensure that academic staff and students are protected from disadvantage, threats or intimidation as a consequence of their lawful academic activities. This ethical obligation also reaches far beyond Australia, of course. We're part of a complex international network of higher education institutions, a global scholarly community where wide-ranging international relationships are cultivated that enrich our academic activities and service. It's essential that the free exchange of ideas and those of our colleagues in higher education is protected, because it's only through continued curiosity, open questioning and reasoned debate that new knowledge and innovation will be created and shared, and controversial ideas can be discussed safely. By forming the SAR Australia section, we will be coordinating and strengthening our national efforts in support of the global Scholars at Risk initiatives. It signifies that Australia SAR members are committed to defending and promoting academic freedom and free speech locally and internationally. Key aspects of our collaboration will be around research, education and advocacy, and mobilising our staff and students to contribute in these areas. Where we're able to assist displaced scholars, either through virtual support of their scholarship or temporary hosting, we will work together to create solutions. The University of the Sunshine Coast is proud to be leading the establishment of SAR Australia with Scholars at Risk and bringing together the 14 foundational Australian universities with the National Tertiary Education Union to collaborate and share resources. This development will increase our expertise in academic freedom and deepen our understanding of the threats being experienced by scholars around the globe. On this World Humanitarian Day, we are committing, not just in words, but also in action, to a partnership that will amplify our voices in advocating for colleagues experiencing attack. It will see us working together closely and courageously in promoting the core value of academic freedom worldwide. It is now my pleasure and privilege to introduce the Honourable Robert French, AC. Robert French served as Chief Justice of Australia from September 2008 until January 2017. He served as a judge of the Federal Court of Australia from November 1986 until his appointment as Chief Justice of the High Court in September 2008. From 1994 to 1998, he was the President of the National Native Title Tribunal. He was elected as Chancellor of the University of Western Australia in December 2017.
My thanks to the Scholars at Risk Network for the opportunity to participate in this important event. On the 14th of February 1990, the Voyager 1 spacecraft, about 6 billion kilometres from the Sun and on its way out of the solar system, looked back and took a photograph of planet Earth. The photograph became known as the pale blue dot. In the vastness of interplanetary space, that is how our planet appeared. To look back at our home in that image is to realise how small and fragile it is, and how fragile is the existence of the human race that lives upon it. The human brain and the intelligence, curiosity and creativity that resides in it, along with a capacity for cooperative action, has yielded great advances in our growth and survival as a species. Scholars who teach transmit our accumulated knowledge. Scholars who research create new knowledge of ourselves and our universe. All are crucial to our great planetary endeavour. And yet, there are aspects of human nature that have been with us for millennia, aspects that engender fear of the new, of scholarship, of the discovery and transmission of historic truths, and the creation of new understandings that call into question established orders and belief systems. Scholars are supported and celebrated in many ways around the world, but they are also at risk from a variety of ways from those whose desire to exercise power over others or whose sense of identity or security cannot tolerate new learning, and with it changes to human awareness. A fortiori if those changes affect vested interests. Examples can be found within autocracies, theocracies and non-democratic authoritarian governments which rely upon command and control of their populations for survival. In a sense, these are obvious examples. But examples are also to be found in the democracies. The scholarship which challenges vested interests and ideologies may be attacked, marginalised, or in some cases suppressed. Threats to scholarship can even be found within institutions of higher learning, where new scholarship which challenges the old or the articulation of controversial views offensive to some threatens established positions, organisational interests, or the interests of particular groups which have influence within or upon the organisation. The freedom of scholars to acquire and transmit knowledge and to create new knowledge cannot be taken for granted. It requires organised protection against infringements of scholarly freedom, which are manifested in many different ways around the world. There are, happily, international networks of organisations and individuals dedicated to this task. And the network known as Scholars at Risk, which is launched in Australia today, is a leading actor in this area. And I'm pleased to say that my university, the University of Western Australia, has joined that network. There are formal public statements of international legal support for the protection of scholarship under the rubric of academic freedom and the distinct but related concept of freedom of speech. The human rights and freedoms recognised in international human rights instruments have particular importance in their application to scholars. They were prefigured in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights promulgated by the United Nations on the 10th of December 1948. An important sequel to that declaration was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The rights and freedoms which it recognised and which are found in other international instruments and national laws include the right to freedom of thought and conscience and religion, the right to freedom of expression, including the right to seek, receive and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, and the right to freedom of association with others. There are science-specific commitments embraced in the so-called right to science in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It embraces the freedom that is indispensable to scientific research and creativity, and the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its application. An example of a specific protection of academic freedom is to be found in Article 13 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which provides that the arts and scientific research shall be free of constraint and that academic freedom shall be respected. That idea of academic freedom, of course, has a long and rather complex history. However, in 1997, UNESCO published a report coupled with a recommendation that academic freedom be defined as the right without constriction by prescribed doctrine to freedom of teaching and discussion, freedom in carrying out research and disseminating and publishing the results thereof, freedom to express freely their opinion about the institution or system in which they work, freedom from institutional censorship, and freedom to participate in professional or representative academic bodies. That freedom, so defined, is a freedom against all comers, state and non-state actors, and the institutions in which scholars are employed. Of course, linked to that concept is the notion of institutional autonomy in higher education, which is that degree of self-governance necessary for effective decision-making regarding academic work, standards, management and related activities, consistent with systems of public accountability, especially in respect of funding provided by the state and respect for academic freedom and human rights. In 2013, the Association of American Universities, the League of European Research Universities, 9 Chinese research universities and the Australian group of 8 research universities joined together to make the HEFI statement, setting out 10 core characteristics of research universities. 2 of them relevant to academic freedom were those numbered 6 and 7. 6 said the responsible exercise of academic freedom by faculty to produce and disseminate knowledge through research, teaching and service without undue constraint, within a research culture based on open inquiry and the continued testing of current understanding, and which extends beyond the vocational or instrumental, sees beyond immediate needs, and seeks to develop the understanding, skills and expertise necessary to fashion the future and help interpret our changing world. And 7, a tolerance, recognition and welcoming of competing views, perspectives, frameworks and positions as being necessary to support progress, along with a commitment to civil debate and discussion to advance understanding and produce new knowledge and technologies. Closer to home in Australia, our Higher Education Support Act provides in a recent amendment that a higher education provider must have a policy that upholds freedom of speech and academic freedom. And it defines academic freedom as A, the freedom of academic staff to teach, discuss and research, and to disseminate and publish the results of their research. B, the freedom of academic staff and students to engage in intellectual inquiry, to express their opinions and beliefs, and to contribute to public debate in relation to their subjects of study and research. C, the freedom of academic staff and students to express their opinions in relation to the higher education provider in which they work or are enrolled. D, the freedom of academic staff to participate in professional or representative academic bodies. E, the freedom of students to participate in student societies and associations. And F, the autonomy of the higher education provider in relation to the choice of academic courses and offerings, the ways in which they are taught, and the choices of research activities and the ways in which they are conducted. Now that policy requirement and that definition are of course regulatory requirements directed to Australian higher education providers. They do not deal directly with external pressures on scholars, although such pressures may be exerted through third parties with whom universities have commercial or other relationships. Despite the high global principles to which I have referred, scholarship and scholars in many different ways are at risk around the world. There are many associations now dedicated to the protections of their freedom. The American Association for the Advancement of Science staffs the Science and Human Rights Coalition, a network of 24 scientific and engineering member associations and 2 affiliated organisations. It is, quote, devoted to facilitating communication and partnership on human rights within and across scientific communities and between these and human rights communities. The American Physical Society has a Committee for the International Freedom of Scientists, on which I served for 3 years as an appointed member. It is responsible for monitoring concerns about the human rights of scientists and makes recommendations to the American Physical Society leadership for action to be taken in particular cases. There's been a long history of involvement in this field by scientists in the United States through a number of bodies. In the United Kingdom, during the Second World War, a society known as the Society for Freedom in Science was established. And its founding propositions were that, firstly, the increase of knowledge by scientific research of all kinds and the maintenance and spread of scientific culture have an independent and primary human value. Secondly, that science can only flourish and therefore can only confer the maximum cultural and practical benefits on society when research is conducted in an atmosphere of freedom. And thirdly, that scientists in countries not under dictatorial rule should cooperate to maintain the freedom necessary for effective work and to help fellow scientists in all parts of the world to maintain or secure this freedom. Australia itself is represented on the International Science Council Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science by Professor Cheryl Prager, Emeritus Professor at the University of Western Australia. That council was created in 2018 by the merger of the International Council for Science and the International Social Sciences Council. It describes itself as the only international non-governmental organisation bringing together the natural and social sciences and the largest global organisation of its type. The remit of Scholars at Risk, which launches its network in Australia today, runs wider than the natural sciences. Its entry into Australia is greatly to be welcomed. Its operation and history will be explained in detail by others. It was established more than 20 years ago. It covers 500 network institutions and 50 countries. Its core protection work is to provide direct assistance to threatened scholars, including the arrangement of temporary research and teaching positions at member institutions. Its 20-year record to 2020 is finding 1,400 positions at 300 host campuses, representing over $25 million US by way of support for scholars under threat. That is just one aspect of the range of services which it offers. And as I observed before, I'm very pleased to say that UWA has joined the network. This launch is held in association with International Humanitarian Day, which includes discussion of academic freedom organised by 7 Australian universities and the National Tertiary Education Union, who together constitute the founding members of the SAR Australian section. The theme for the launch has been described as centring on ways to mobilise the Australian Academy and society at large to support academic freedom and stand in solidarity with threatened scholars around the world. I have no hesitation in expressing my support for the work of SAR and to say how pleased I am that it has come to Australia and has been embraced by important elements of the Australian higher education network. Returning to my opening theme, SAR is a planetary network dedicated to the protection and advancement of activities vital to the growth and survival of humanity. A moment's reflection on that extraordinary image of the pale blue dot taken by the Voyager spacecraft in 1990 offers us a direct and graphic argument for the global importance of this work. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Adrian Stone. Adrian Stone is a Redmond Berry Distinguished Professor and Kathleen Fitzpatrick Australian Laureate Fellow at the Melbourne Law School. She researches in the areas of constitutional law and constitutional theory with particular attention to freedom of expression. She's published widely in international and Australian journals. She's the author, with Caroline Evans, of Open Minds, Academic Freedom and Freedom of Speech. Adrian is the president of the International Association of Constitutional Law and is elected fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and Australian Academy of Law. Adrian, welcome to the SAR Australia launch.
Thank you very much, and what a pleasure and an honour it is to be here on this really important day. And thank you for that kind introduction. I should begin with an acknowledgement that I am speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose lands I live and work. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the Scholars at Risk Network and the University of the Sunshine Coast for this lovely invitation. It's such an important initiative. And can I say just how very affecting it was to hear from Robert Quinn of the really important work that Scholars at Risk is doing really as we speak to assist scholars in Afghanistan. Now, my remarks today will reflect on 3 ideas that I take to be central to the Scholars at Risk work: academic freedom, universities, and democracy. And I want to draw out the connections between them to make the central point that universities are institutions of democracy. Academic freedom is needed, not just to support academic work for its own sake, but also as a mechanism for protecting and promoting democratic government. Now, these remarks draw from my recent academic work, in particular a book which I published with my co-author, the Vice-Chancellor and President of Griffith University, Professor Carolyn Evans. And so I want to acknowledge her and also the Australian Research Council for supporting the work. I should add, however, that especially anything I say that's today that's particularly controversial should not be attributed to my co-author, and that the opinions are mine. Now, let me turn to say something about academic freedom. In my experience, although it's a value that as scholars we hold dear, it's actually not much thought or spoken about in Australian universities. Indeed, since I have been doing work on academic freedom, many colleagues have commented to me that they've rarely, if ever, in the course of long academic careers, had conversations about or opportunity to think in depth about the nature of academic freedom and its purposes. Scholars at Risk reminds it of its importance. It's an organisation that focuses on academics who experience threats to academic freedom and indeed to their lives and liberty of a kind of dimension that academic freedoms, that Australian academics do not have to face. Now, this reflects, no doubt, a degree of privilege in the world and the great fortune of our comparatively tranquil politics. But the purpose of my remarks today is to pierce any sense of complacency that we might have, and to think that because Australian scholars do not experience the grave risks to lives that we see elsewhere, we should not think that threats to academic freedom are something that happens in the rest of the world only. On the contrary, I think we need to be very attentive to academic freedom in Australia as an element of our democracy. And once we make that connection to democracy, there are reasons to be quite concerned given the stresses on democratic government at present. My argument also has a flip side. Just as universities and academic freedom are important for democracy, it means that universities themselves require commitment to democracy in quite a full sense. That is, universities thrive in societies that are truly committed to free academic inquiry. Democracy needs universities, and universities need democracy. To elaborate these ideas, I'll hope you'll forgive me if I state some preliminary concepts briefly. I should start by being clear about what I take to be the nature and purpose of a university. The case for academic freedom is grounded in an understanding of universities and their fundamental and central purpose. Now, universities are complex social institutions and they have many social roles, but their central mission, their most important task, and the one that distinguishes them from other institutions, is the advancement of knowledge through teaching and research. Second, I should say something about what I mean by academic freedom, although I also point to the very brilliant exposition just given by the Honourable Robert French. But stated simply, academic freedom is a claim that academics personally, and some others engaged in academic inquiry, are entitled to certain freedoms and privileges not enjoyed by all members of the university and not accorded to other professional enterprises. As commonly understood, the core activity to which academic freedom applies are research, publication, teaching, and engagement in and discussion of university governance. Notice here, the idea of academic freedom is not synonymous with freedom of speech, nor is it well described by a general term like intellectual freedom. Academic freedom attaches to academic work and academic governance, and it does not attach to all expressive or even all intellectual activity that occurs on campus. And lastly, let me turn now to draw the connections between academic freedom and the search for knowledge. The obvious argument for academic freedom turns on the basic proposition that free academic inquiry is conducive to the production and dissemination of knowledge. In other words, academic progress is most likely where academic inquiry is driven only by the inquiring mind of the academic and unconstrained by governments, university bureaucracies, and other external pressures. Now, I don't want to oversimplify that argument. If I had a couple of hours, I could discuss some of the obvious questions that in my experience are raised by that simple statement. Worries about why is that an idea of academic freedom reproduces some of the problems that arise from an excessively absolutist notion of freedom of speech. These are dealt with in much more detail in the longer work. But let me just point for the moment to one premise of academic freedom that distinguishes the freedom that academics have from a generalized freedom of speech or academic freedom. And that is the role of disciplines in academic inquiry. The key to understanding academic freedom is that academic inquiry pursues knowledge in very distinctive ways. Universities pursue their mission through academic disciplines, which are characterized by methods that are designed to ensure expertise, independence. Mastering these methods is part of research training. And among other things, they insist upon evidence, justification, and expose ideas systematically to tests capable of invalidating them. And they require independent judgment. Therefore, while academic methods and disciplinary standards can and should be contested, academic freedom requires that the disciplines are ultimately self-governing. What constitutes good science, good philosophy, or good history is not a matter for university administrators or politicians to decide. Is a matter for scientists, philosophers, and historians to decide. Now, these constraints, which may sound excessively scholarly, I'm insisting on for a couple of reasons. They have important consequences for academic freedom. First, they are what make university research unique. Universities can't claim to monopolize the search for truth in our society, but they do it in a highly distinctive way. Secondly, they accord academic inquiry a unique degree of independence. So, for instance, while journalists are also committed to independence and to the search for knowledge, they may not have the research expertise nor the broad research mission of universities. Think tanks, commercial research organisations, on the other hand, may aim to advance knowledge across a broad range of research areas, and they may house researchers with special expertise, but they may not, and often do not, have the independence of the university academic. This combination of expertise and independence is an answer to some of the worries that I've alluded to. And I hope it's clear, for instance, by invoking the idea of knowledge, I understand it as provisional and revisable, as indeed disciplinary methods insist. But with that understanding of the nature of academic inquiry, the purpose of universities, and the academic freedom which is there to support academic inquiry, let me turn to my central point. Universities, by virtue of this role in advancing knowledge and by virtue of the independence and expertise they bring to the task, are important institutions of democracy. Now, the argument or the connection between universities and democracies is often made, but most commonly, it's put as part of the pedagogical function of universities. That is, it's often said that a university education creates an active and engaged citizenry. That's an idea that makes sense. A university should equip students with knowledge about the world and with the intellectual skills that enable them to be active and effective citizens. But the claim is at best very partial support for academic freedom. After all, not all citizens attend universities, nor should they, and it cannot reasonably be claimed that a university education is either necessary or sufficient for good citizenship. And for that reason, I don't place too much emphasis on this aspect of a university's social role. In my view, universities support government much more powerfully and distinctively through the provision of expertise and information. In part, this comes through the training of experts who themselves take part in government. Think of high-level administrators, public servants, policymakers, judges, and experts of all kinds, or hold governments accountable, like journalists and lawyers. But university also informs and enables policymaking that provides a foundation for governmental decision-making. And the most important form of democratic support is provided neither through the education of students, nor through the provision of expertise directly to government, but to the citizenry as a whole. A critical part of democratic government relies upon the participation of an informed citizenry in public discourse, and then ultimately in electing governments and holding them to account. And the complexity of modern governments is that at any point, our public discourse can only be understood in light of the reliable and independent research of the kind that only universities produce. And let me pause to notice how much more important reliable and independent sources of information and expertise are in the digital economy, where we have seen a breakdown of the legacy media and a growth in forms of digital communication that make it very difficult for citizens to understand the reliability of information that they find through those means. So, in my view, universities are important knowledge institutions that support democracy by rendering their citizens as a whole, and not just those who are members of the university, democratically competent. Now, let me turn to the other side of the coin and consider why universities, if they really are to thrive, require a healthy democratic environment. I think it will be obvious to all of us that the very nature of a university's role makes them vulnerable to attack. And that's why I've made this argument in some detail. Universities are by design institutions that are likely to prove challenging for those in authority. Their raison d'etre is to challenge the intellectual status quo, and in doing so may well and will inevitably, in fact, challenge the political and social status quo. And they enable citizens to engage in that uncomfortable task of holding governments to account and making democratic choices. If any evidence of this were needed, we could see it in the way that authoritarian societies treat university intellectuals. And if we turn our gaze to the rest of the world, and of course there are particularly disturbing scenes that we are all witnessing in these very days, it's very clear that there are very many very upsetting cases. Now, there are some places where democracy is really clearly under threat. Of course, we all have Afghanistan in mind today, but we can see it in Hungary. We can see it clearly in the prominent attacks on academics in India and in Brazil and in Poland. And I wish particularly to acknowledge my University of Sydney colleague and fellow member of the International Association of Constitutional Law, Wojciech Zdursky, who has been subject to ideologically motivated prosecution. Now, there is reason to expect that these cases will multiply given the modern circumstances of democratic decline worldwide. As authoritarianism rises, the work of something like Scholars of Risk is even more important. But there are threats to academic freedom that arise from democratic decline, even in societies like ours, where the threats are weaker. The rise of populism is frankly a natural enemy for universities. Following someone like Rogers Brubaker, I consider populism to be a form of political thought that insists that there is one true people and excludes elites and experts from the idea of the true people. And for that reason, populism is naturally very hostile to universities and to academics. Now, combined with threats of a more traditionally neoliberal type, which treat universities like other corporate bodies and govern them as such without references to academic values, there is quite a potent force that I think threatens the universities, even in Australia, and societies like it. Indeed, as I speak with academics around the world, almost all of them, even in the liberal democracies of the West, recognise some form of the attack on universities that is at fever pitch. In some places, they recognise it in their own societies as well, ranging from cultural attacks from the populist right, excessive government regulation, and excessive managerialism within universities itself. So I have insisted on this connection between academic freedom and democracy to make clear what is at stake and to clarify and strengthen the argument for academic freedom. Academic freedom is not a special pleading. It's a principle that protects the public good in the advancement of knowledge and in the healthy and functioning of democratic government, and it operates for the benefit of everyone. And second, if you forgive me a moment's indulgence in the ideas of my own discipline, it means that universities are in some senses constitutional institutions and that scholars are constitutional actors. I do not draw a sharp distinction, therefore, between scholars who are activists in support of democracy or some other cause, although I have no wish to cast aspersions on academics who work in an overtly activist mode. I think there's a very important place for such work in the academy, provided it respects core academic values. But I do insist that all academics working in good faith and in open-minded pursuit of knowledge are all the time engaged in the provision of the essential infrastructure for democracy. So we should take pride in our role in a democracy, but we need also to recognise our dependence upon it. Scholars all have an interest, and I think really a moral obligation to the rest of society to promote a strong understanding of these connections. We have few substantive commitments by virtue of our role as scholars, but I think we are committed to democracy hand in hand with our commitment to advancing knowledge through teaching and research. Let me close by saying how wonderful it is to see the opening of an Australian Scholars at Risk section. And I know that it'll be there through the sprint and the marathon for Scholars at Risk, lending support to scholars who are threatened elsewhere. I hope also that it will provide a very important impetus for assessing the health of our own environment for universities and for mobilisation in support of academic freedom in universities, precisely to protect that democracy on which we all rely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. As you have all likely gathered, Professor Adrian Stone is one of the foremost minds on academic freedom today, and we are so grateful for her attending and sharing with us. I think because of timing, we're going to move straight into our plenary session. This will feature Sophie McNeil from Human Rights Watch, Jeannie Ray, professor at Victoria University, and Sam Clintworth, National Director of Amnesty International Australia. You will be able to submit questions, and we will do our best to take audience questions during the second half. Please just submit them into the chat box, and we will direct them to our panelists. Today, moderating, we have Sophia O'Brien, lecturer in law at the University of the Sunshine Coast. Sophia currently lectures in constitutional, corporations, and public international law. And she is the representative for Scholars at Risk on our International Advisory Committee. We are so grateful for all the work she has done at SAR and are delighted that she will be bringing us these wonderful candidates today. So Sophie, I think we'll move directly to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joyce, and thank you for your kind words. And thanks also to the SAR team at NYU, especially you, Maddie, for playing such an enormously supportive role today. And before we kick off, another round of thank yous to Eva Marie Cito and Joanne Scott of USC, have been the driving forces of this launch today. So full credit to you both. Now, as moderator of this session, we're obviously sparking things up with a different format. We have three amazing speakers to bring you today, each with unique perspectives on academic freedom in Australia. I'd like to point out that this is a bit of a change of pace in that these speakers are on the front line to some degree of the issue of of human rights defence in mobilising that aspiration for a vibrant civil society and recognising the importance of free intellectual and academic debate within it. I'm conscious we're all very busy people and we have a timeline to keep to, so I will respectfully endeavour to keep each of our speakers to a 15-minute window before we then move to a Q&A session. And of course, you're all invited to submit your questions. Now, our first speaker today is Sam Clintworth, who's representing Amnesty International Australia, and of course, on a very important day, World Humanitarian Day. Sam is a long-term, passionate and dedicated human rights defender. She is National Director of Amnesty International Australia and has been since 2019. And she has been resolute in advocating for human rights and rights holders on a local, national and international scale. The career spanning 30 years, predominantly in the community and not-for-profit sectors, and qualifications including Bachelor of Laws and MBA, and certification as a psychologist, Sam has used her expertise to actively champion better governance and policy and to challenge injustice, with a particular focus on vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals and communities. Sam, thanks for being here. The floor is yours for the next 15 minutes or so.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting from around the country today. And for me, that's the beautiful land of the Yugambeh people. I would like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I would like, as earlier speakers have done as well, to also acknowledge the situation in Afghanistan and the risk to scholars and academics, particularly women. Amnesty International globally considers academics are at particular risk of reprisals from the Taliban, and we are calling for the government to urgently give them safe passage out of Afghanistan. Amnesty International has a presence in over 150 countries in the world. Through our detailed research and determined campaigning, we help fight abuses of human rights worldwide. We bring torturers to justice, we change oppressive laws, and free people jailed just for voicing their opinion. Around the world, we challenge injustice, stand with people and communities who come under attack, encourage governments and others to respect human rights, and raise awareness of the international standards that should protect us all. I welcome the launch of Students at Risk in Australia. We know from our work the benefit of people power and are confident the Australian section of Students at Risk will be impactful in its work, and we congratulate the various universities across the country for signing on and congratulate the University of the Sunshine Coast on the launch. Australia has an important role to play in defending all human rights, including academic freedom, freedom of speech and expression, and the right to safety. I am always conscious that I work in an environment of relative safety. When my direct colleagues in Turkey, the director and chair of Amnesty in Turkey, are imprisoned for doing exactly the same work I do here safely. My colleagues in India had their personal and professional bank accounts frozen by government and were unable to pay staff for many months, forcing us to shut down, and staff were also being harassed in community. My colleagues in Hong Kong battle an environment of decreasing personal safety under the security laws imposed in 2020. They are unable to safely undertake the work of human rights defending in the same way we can here. With that privilege comes a responsibility on Australia, globally, and particularly within the Asia-Pacific region. We need to have a loud voice in advocacy because we can safely. And this work has never been more important than now. Amnesty International works with academics all around the world who face terrible human rights abuses. They face these abuses because of their work as academics, because of their activism, because they take part in protests. Sometimes it's guilt by association, and sometimes it's simply because their work has taken them overseas. They face suspension or expulsion from schools and universities, smear campaigns in state media and on social media. But worse, they face imprisonment, torture, ill treatment, unfair trials, and some have even been sentenced to death. I'd like to share a few cases and jurisdictions of concern. Dr. Ahmad Driza Dalali, a Swedish Iranian who was sentenced to death in 2017. He was arrested after returning to Iran from Sweden, where he worked as a doctor and professor at Stockholm's Karolinska Institute. Ahmad Driza believes he was imprisoned because he refused to use his academic ties to spy for the Iranian authorities. The court found him guilty of the vague charge of corruption on earth, partly based on confessions, which Ahmad Driza says were pre-written and which he was forced to read out in front of a video camera. These confessions were then shown on national TV. In November last year, he was told that his death sentence was to be carried out immediately. At that moment, people all around the world mobilised, calling for the Iranian authorities to halt this execution. He remains at risk of execution, but it is because of that mobilisation, the power of people's united voices, that he is still alive today. What that means is the Iranian authorities listened to the people who mobilised, and it means that there is more time for us to pressure them to quash his death sentence, release him so that he can finally be reunited with his family. Ilham Tohti and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Ilham is a Uyghur economist who has criticised oppressive policies that target Uyghurs in China. But he also wrote about the ways to overcome the differences between ethnic groups in China with a particular focus on dialogue and reconciliation. For this, he was sentenced to life in prison for separatism in 2014. 7 of his students were also imprisoned on separatism charges, and their whereabouts, sadly, remain unknown. Uyghurs are an ethnic minority group of mostly Muslim people who live in Xinjiang in the far west of China. In recent years, they have been subjected to a campaign of persecution by the Chinese government that we believe constitutes crimes against humanity. At least 1 million Uyghurs have been arbitrarily detained in what the Chinese government calls re-education camps. The government claims that these camps are vocational training centres, but our research has found that the education or training provided is actually a form of indoctrination to force Uyghurs to disavow Islam, to forego practicing their Uyghur language and culture, and to study Chinese Communist Party propaganda. Amnesty conducted interviews and spoke to dozens of people who had been detained for our most recent research in this area. Every single person we spoke to had been tortured. And we know that those detained included teachers and professors, people who hardly need re-educating. Ahmed Samir Santawei is a master's student in Egypt who researches sexual and reproductive rights. In June 2021, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison on charges of publishing false news based on social media posts where he criticised human rights violations in Egyptian prisons and the government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. He was disappeared for over 5 days, and the authorities asked him about his academic work and research during interrogations. Matthew Hedges. Matthew was on a 2-week research trip for his PhD in the United Arab Emirates in 2018, when he was imprisoned on spying charges. His case highlighted the issue of imprisoned academics to many in the West. In November 2018, he was sentenced to life in prison, but following people pressure, was pardoned shortly after on UAE's National Day. Many academics remain in prison in the UAE, including Dr. Nasser bin Gaith, an economist and university lecturer who was sentenced to 10 years in prison in 2017 for calling for human rights in the UAE. Amnesty considers him to be a prisoner of conscience, someone who is imprisoned only because of their peaceful activism, and are calling on his immediate release. Many jurisdictions across the world prove difficult for academics. When we look at Hong Kong, under the national security law, which was introduced in 2020, the space for academic freedom in Hong Kong is shrinking. Last week, the Hong Kong Professional Teachers Union disbanded in the face of enormous pressure from the authorities in both Hong Kong and mainland China. The union was threatened with investigations under the national security law and was subject to a smear campaign in the state media and social media, accusing the union of spreading political propaganda and describing them as a malignant tumour that needed to be eradicated. Since the enactment of the national security law, the Hong Kong government have been rapidly eliminating dissenting voices in schools. The Education Bureau has now banned any and all peaceful expressions of views that it deems to be politically motivated. It banned teachers from schools for facilitating discussions related to freedom of expression. In November 2020, police arrested 3 students under the national security law after they joined a peaceful protest on a university campus. When we look at Belarus, in the last year in Belarus, hundreds of thousands of teachers and students have taken to the streets in protests which have swept the country, following widely disputed elections. In response to the protests, the authorities have cracked down on protesters, including by targeting students and teachers who are, as is so often the case, at the heart of protest movements. Amnesty has spoken with academics and students from Belarus who paint a picture of constant harassment and intimidation aimed at silencing any and all dissent. Academics spoke of their protests on campus being photographed by both the authorities and the university, and they fear reprisals. At least 500 students have been detained by the authorities, and at least 153 have been arbitrarily suspended from universities. So what do we do? How does Amnesty hold people to account? We see our role as giving a voice to those who don't have one, shining a light on abuses that occur outside of the public eye, and building awareness and mobilising action. In doing this, we call on governments and companies to uphold, create, or change laws or policies that will protect human rights. Amnesty holds governments accountable for detaining academics by researching human rights abuses, whether they are against an individual or a community targeted because of their work, their activism, or their ethnicity. We undertake direct advocacy with governments and embassies where human rights abuses are occurring, and we also place pressure on relevant government ministers here and country ambassadors based in Australia. We also, of course, work directly with people affected by the abuses and their families to campaign, advocating to the people in power and mobilising our movement of 10 million people in support of those campaigns. Where there are crises, we send experts on missions into countries such as Syria and Nauru, where human rights abuses are occurring, and their mission is to investigate and report. We work with the world's media to expose human rights abuses and to hold the guilty to account. We know that people power can make a massive difference. It shows people in authority that there are people all around the world who are willing to stand with detained academics like Ilham and Ahmad Driza, and who won't be silenced while governments continue to detain them. The pressure comes from mobilising people to take action and mobilising voices, amplifying our voice. If you were looking for practical ways to get involved in advocacy efforts in the Australian higher education space, campus networks are a powerful way of doing so. Becoming part of a movement, Students at Risk, Amnesty, Students for Climate Change, or a cause close to your heart will give you the skills, experience, networks, and resources to hold the powerful to account. You will be part of a community of fellow human rights activists who are achieving social change every day. Now, not everyone relates to the word activist, but for me, it simply means feeling something so deeply that doing nothing is not an option, being compelled to act. Activism is about taking action and advocating for change on an issue that is important to you. It's also about inspiring others to take action as well. And when we talk about an action, it is essentially any activity that puts pressure on the people with the power to do the right thing on your issue. That pressure you create might be large or small, but when combined with everyone else's, it can be absolutely enormous. These actions take many forms and range in terms of complexity. It could be something as quick and easy as signing an online petition or communicating with a politician by letter or email. It might be educating other people in the community on an issue and encouraging them to take action. It could also be meeting face-to-face with those in power to tell them what you feel needs to change. It's helping to grow a movement to increase power and impact. But it's also about doing it in a way that works for you based on your own capacity and what you feel comfortable doing. We know we are more powerful when we stand together than when we stand alone. And being part of a group means that you can take action. Whether that action is raising awareness on campus of crimes against humanity in Xinjiang at a panel like this, or organising for students to send letters to the Iranian ambassador calling for him to quash Ahmad Driza's death sentence. Or you could also write solidarity letters to people in prison like Ilham and let them know that you're standing with them and that they are not alone. Amnesty activists and campus groups all around the world took action for Aziza Al-Yusuf, a computer science professor and women's rights activist in Saudi Arabia. She campaigned for years for women to be allowed to drive and was detained because of that in 2018. But because of those actions, because of people mobilising, because of people standing together, she was released in March 2019 and able to return to her family. There is much to be done, but so much can be achieved by our working together. We very much welcome Students at Risk in Australia, and thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this exciting launch today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. That was so insightful. And thank you to the team at Amnesty International Australia for engaging with us at this really critical juncture. You've raised some really important themes I'd like to return to in Q&A. And I'd also really like to encourage those who are listening to submit your questions. I know everyone will have some burning questions that they are wanting to ask. Feel free to send those in to direct either to Sam or our subsequent speakers. Now, Sam, you've really highlighted the importance not just of the international perspective of how scholars abroad are facing rising threats of intolerance, of ideological attack, of really serious abuses against their person, but also at an Australian level, what we can be doing to use that privilege. And as Professor Stone had mentioned before, the relative sense of privilege that we do feel as Australian academics and public voices to be advocating not just for academic freedom abroad, but here as well. Our next speaker has a set of perspectives that will be equally insightful and which also speak to this disturbing spectre of surveillance and reprisals of students and academics. I'd like to introduce Sophie McNeil, who is the Australian researcher for Human Rights Watch based in WA. She was formerly an investigative reporter with ABC TV's Four Corners, where she produced some programs on the Hong Kong protest movement, again, salient to what you've just been talking about, Sam, and the mass arbitrary detention of Xinjiang's Muslims by the Chinese government. Sophie was also a foreign correspondent for the ABC and SBS in the Middle East, working across the region in countries such as Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Egypt, and Turkey, as well as Israel and Palestine. She is the author of We Can't Say We Didn't Know, Dispatches from an Age of Impunity. And once again, what an impressive caliber of speakers we have today. Sophie, we're really looking forward to hearing your perspectives and to you sharing what are sometimes difficult topics to talk about, but ones that we need to know about. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Sam, for your insightful presentation. And thank you to the SAR team for all your hard work in putting this wonderful launch together. I'd just like to start by acknowledging I'm on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in Fremantle in Western Australia. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm here today to speak about why this work is so important here in Australia, because whilst we've heard a lot about what's going on around the world, sometimes it's more shocking to realise what is happening here at home, that perhaps we don't realise how it's going on and exactly where. So at the end of June, we put out a report at Human Rights Watch that I authored, and it was called They Don't Understand the Fear We Have, How China's Long Reach of Repression Undermines Academic Freedom at Australian Universities. And while Human Rights Watch has been researching growing Chinese government threats to academic freedom globally over the last few years, this was the first report that we have done focusing on one country. And so why Australia? Well, before the pandemic, approximately 40% of all onshore international students in Australia came from China. So roughly 10% of all students attending Australian universities were from the PRC. And even with borders closed due to the pandemic, international education remains one of our top exports as unis put courses online and as some international students remain in the country. And this high number of Chinese international students is unique to Australia. So compared to the UK, it's 6% there, 3% in Canada, 2% in the United States. And what we've seen in Australia as Australian universities have become increasingly reliant on income from Chinese international students, we've seen a growing number of reported incidents of restrictions on academic freedom, of intimidation, and of censorship on matters relating to China. There was also a high-profile incident last August involving a colleague of mine, Elaine Pearson, our Australia director, when she was quoted talking about the need for human rights in Hong Kong. This happened at UNSW University in New South Wales, where there was a backlash from Chinese government supporters and Chinese students when this article was posted on the Twitter account of UNSW. Unfortunately, we saw the university take that article down, move it around, put it up on different websites, and apologise to a certain extent for that piece. And the idea for this work, this report I wrote, came directly out of that incident when we were contacted by Chinese international students who were really upset with how UNSW had responded. And they said, you know, what about us? Are people aware that we exist? Not every Chinese international student that comes to Australia is supportive of the government, and we would like our voices heard. And this is certainly something that when we sat back and thought about, we thought was incredibly true. Despite all this interest about foreign interference in Australia and the close scrutiny of the Australian university system, we haven't heard the voices of these students. And in fact, it's been a very narrow lens, this whole debate, seen through national security, rather than looking at it through a human rights dimension and an academic freedom dimension. So that was the inspiration and the drive behind doing this work. And as far as I'm aware, our report, which because it was my first report for Human Rights Watch, you know, I did go over the limit by 5,000 words. It's very in-depth. It's 100 pages. It took a couple of months to do, but it is the most in-depth research that anyone in Australia has done, talking to students and academics about these issues. Because whilst there has been specific studies done with Chinese international students to actually ask them about the Communist Party and how it impacts their lives, it's really difficult to do this work because of the fear that people have. And so the methodology behind this work, we did nearly 50 interviews across 17 universities in 6 states and territories, half with pro-democracy students and half with academics. And these were academics who either specialised in China studies or they taught classes where the majority of students were from the PRC. And for every person I interviewed, there were several more who I was in contact with, but they didn't want to talk because of this fear, because of the fear of surveillance. And in particular, this was in relation to students from Hong Kong after the passing of the national security law, which we know is extrajudicial, and people have great fears, and it's had a very chilling impact on the Hong Kong community here in Australia. So because of security concerns, all the interviews I did were conducted via encrypted apps and secure networks and servers. All the names used in the report are pseudonyms, and several people I interviewed had returned to China because of COVID. So we had to really go to great lengths to protect their names, their identities, and give them security. And you know, it's partly why this work hasn't been done, because it is very difficult, but you know, Human Rights Watch has good background in doing this kind of work. And so that was, I think, why people trusted us to do these interviews. And throughout the process, we had really constructive engagement with the university sector. You know, it's not our kind of model to just stand on the side and throw stones at universities. We worked with the sector on this report all along, engaging with vice chancellors, deputy vice chancellors of international who focus on these students, Universities Australia, and some particular vice chancellors who've been engaged with the University Foreign Interference Task Force that is happening at the moment with Home Affairs. So the key findings from this work: so Australian universities have failed to protect the academic freedom of students from China and of academics who criticise the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, leaving them vulnerable to harassment and intimidation by Chinese government supporters. So despite the Chinese government being thousands of kilometres away, many Chinese students in Australia say that they alter their behaviour and they self-censor to avoid threats and harassments from fellow classmates, and to avoid being reported on to authorities back home. This is what they all lived in great fear of, that someone here in Australia would report them back home, and this would have severe repercussions for their loved ones. So more than half of the pro-democracy students I interviewed from mainland China and Hong Kong had experienced direct harassment and intimidation from Chinese classmates, including threats of physical violence, being doxed online, being threatened with doxing, and these acts occurred in various environments, including online, in person, and off campus. And students were targeted after being identified as criticising the CCP, expressing support for democracy, or attending a protest in support of Hong Kong democracy or alarm at what's happening to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. So everyone we interviewed, and we did nearly 50 interviews, told us that this atmosphere of fear had worsened in recent years, and increasingly free speech and academic freedom in relation to China in Australia was increasingly under threat. And for nearly all the academics interviewed, they said that how to discuss China in the classroom had become a major issue in their professional lives. And half of the faculty said that they practice regular self-censorship when talking about China. So this was due to fears of visas to China being rejected for Chinese colleagues and fears for their families still back in China, which drove this self-censorship. And what was really alarming was that nearly all academics highlighted that their universities had failed to recognise this culture of self-censorship and to develop any official policy to address it and to support staff, even after it had been raised with their supervisors. Teaching online during COVID has also posed new challenges, as course material designed for Australian campuses is now being accessed by students behind the Great Firewall of China. And this has posed new and difficult security risks for students and academics. But despite this, academics that we interviewed said that their university had not offered any official guidance on teaching Chinese students remotely and on the security considerations that should have been taken into account. And it was just so heartbreaking doing interview after interview, speaking to these students who just expressed such dismay that they felt their Australian universities had not done enough to protect them and their academic freedom. And most of the students we interviewed who did experience harassment said they did not report it to their university. And when we asked them why, they said it's because they believed that their university was more sympathetic to nationalistic Chinese students or gave priority to maintaining their relationship with the Chinese government than to students like them. So that it was really this feeling of being lost, of being alone, of not knowing where to turn that came out in the interviews. And they described the stress and anxiety, how this impacted their daily life in Australia, how they had to weigh up these issues every time they decided what to say in class, who to be friends with, what kind of activities they could attend. And there's some really concerning case studies that we unearthed in this research. So we verified 3 cases of students in which police in China visited or asked to meet with their families regarding the students' activities in Australia. And so while this number is low, you know, this report is the tip of the iceberg in the sense that the work was only done over a period of several months. The number of people I wanted to speak to, but who wouldn't speak to me because of their fears, and the patterns that you see when you read the report, when you hear what the students talk about in their experiences, and then what the academics as well have documented in their classrooms. So one of the other case studies that's very concerning is that a student who expressed support for democracy in front of classmates in Australia has since had their passport confiscated by Chinese authorities upon returning home. And this is particularly concerning because we had raised this incident with the Australian University, and there was no repercussions when this student was initially threatened by a classmate because of their expression of support for democracy. And so when they returned home to China, this threat to report them, it does appear like it was followed through, and this young person is now facing significant risk and fear. We also documented the case of an academic in Australia who was bullied and harassed and doxxed online after they just happened to mention Taiwan as a country within their classroom that they don't even teach in humanities, actually. And they defended a Taiwanese student who had been bullied by one of their classmates. And because of this doxing and these online threats, the Australian university where this academic worked had to temporarily remove their teaching profile from the university website. So that's just another example of how this plays out in terms of the academic sense, for how it plays out for academics. So it's important to note with this research that this abusive behaviour doesn't represent the majority of Chinese students in Australia who do choose to express their views peacefully, but it's carried out by a small but highly motivated and vocal minority who have the power to influence others. And we highlight in the research as well how media outlets in Australia have portrayed Chinese students, all of them, as, you know, unthinking, untrustworthy defenders of the CCP. So, you know, this depiction is very simplistic, it's unfair, and it's at times racist. And it fails to consider the many challenges these young people face when they're suddenly living in a multicultural democracy like Australia after growing up in such a strictly controlled state. So we actually, when you read the report, you'll see that we have great sympathy for these students who are also doing this harassment, because often they have not been made aware of any of what the consequences would be for such behaviour, how inappropriate it is, and they are very vulnerable to exploitation by the Chinese state as well. So we also think that they need protection, and we highlight where we think the universities have failed to do that. I know I want to leave time for questions, so I just want to go through some of our key recommendations to universities. So our number one is to provide deterrence, because universities have failed to lay down a firm red line and make it clear that this kind of political intimidation is not acceptable. When we know that, you know, a lot of these harassments going on, it's not done by official state actors. A lot of it is largely self-motivated. So we do believe that a lot of progress could be made if students were made aware that this kind of conduct violated academic codes of conduct and student policies, and they could lose their position in the universities. So what we've seen so far is many universities had rather sweep these issues under the rug rather than talk about them, because they are very uncomfortable issues for some universities to discuss. That's what we've found and what we document in the report. So we really are calling on universities to speak about these incidents, to provide deterrence, to investigate them, specifically seek out staff and ask them to refer them up and ensure that there's punishments for those who, despite warnings, continue to deliberately engage in this abusive behaviour. You know, one thing that students said to us was, oh, look, I knew where I could report sexual assault on campus, but I had no idea I could report this kind of political harassment. So a lot more education of what mechanisms exist, because there are some services already available, not enough, we believe, but often the students impacted by this kind of harassment aren't aware that it's available to them, but also they don't feel comfortable reporting it to universities. So this is why we also want universities to speak up, so these students no longer feel alone and feel that the universities aren't on their side. And we also have some really simple but practical kind of best practice for teaching staff that we've come up with. So minimize class recordings on sensitive subjects, provide alternatives to group work and discussions, allow for work to be submitted using pseudonyms, acknowledge risk and provide alternatives for teaching online into China, and allow students who feel uncomfortable to opt out of classroom discussions, and enable them to provide them with options to complete coursework once they are able to return to Australia. The Chinese Students and Scholars Association in Australia, we talk about that in our report, and we believe that universities should require all campus organisations which receive funding or support from foreign diplomatic missions to publicly report such information. And we're also calling on universities to provide adequately funded university support services for students from China, so they're not forced to rely on services like the CSSA, which are linked to and supported by the Chinese government. So I look forward to the question section, and thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Sophie. That was really insightful. And again, really highlighting that academic freedom is so much not just an issue abroad solely, and also that it's not just a problem pertaining directly to academics, to those who are researching and teaching, but is very much a matter of the other side of the equation as well. And also just building a link here between, obviously, academic freedom and the very real issue of the physical safety of those students, both here and abroad. So this is not just a foreign problem, and it's very, very timely that we are piercing that bubble of complacency, as Professor Stone put it, to wake up to what's going on here and to start using this opportunity of SAR Australia's chapter launch to really start addressing these issues in a coordinated way. So thank you. Our next speaker is Jeannie Ray. Hi, Jeannie. Jeannie chairs postgraduate programs in international community development and planetary health, as well as teaching gender studies. Jeannie Ray returned to Victoria University in 2018 after completing 2 terms at the NTEU. And Jeannie has been a professional educator and advocate in the post-secondary sector for over 3 decades. She's held education leadership roles in governance and management at VU, including Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Education and Human Development, and Head of the School of Communication and the Arts. So over to you, Jeannie. I'll keep an eye on the clock for about 15 minutes too. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I too will begin by acknowledging country. I wish to acknowledge, recognise and respect the ancestors, elders and emerging leaders of the Bunurong of the Kulin Nations, on whose land I speak from today. I recognise that this land has never been ceded and always will be Aboriginal land. As we share our knowledge and our practices today, I pay my respect to the deep knowledge embedded within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and their ownership of land. I too pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening in today. I too, of course, would like to thank the University of Sunshine Coast for hosting today's important launch and for hosting the Australian chapter. This is a very, very exciting moment. And I want to applaud those who have worked to get us here today to launching this Australian section of Scholars at Risk. I was very fortunate to become involved in SAR back when I was the national president of the National Tertiary Education Union. The NTEU has been a consistent member of Scholars at Risk and has supported Australian universities where our members work to sign on. SAR has been resolute in pursuing academic freedom, not as an abstract nor just an ideal, but the actual pursuit of it, which even when not intentional, has landed academics, researchers and university professionals in dire trouble with ramifications for their livelihoods, their safety and that of their families, for their liberty and even their lives. The practical program of seeking sanctuary in a university in another country has saved lives and allowed some to continue their teaching, their research, their writing. The sad part is, as others have also said this morning, that around the world, circumstances continue to deteriorate and few of those scholars have been able to return home. And indeed, their academic freedom and their rights to free speech and assembly remain compromised even in another country, with consequences to their colleagues, friends and family of speaking out. And that indeed was what Sophie was just speaking to in relation to Chinese students in Australia too. And indeed the experience of international students with whom I work from other countries as well. Australian Universities Review, published by the NTU, with an independent editor and board though, issued a special edition earlier this year. It was called Academic Freedom's Precarious Future, so very much on the same theme that we're speaking on today. It was guest edited by Professor Kristen Lyons of the University of Queensland. Not surprisingly, the Australian contributors focused upon debates and characteristics within Australia, but with resonance across the world. Also included was an important contribution from Peter Grist with Fred D'Agostino, exploring why both academic freedom and media freedom are so difficult to protect. Most will remember that Peter Grist, now a professor at the University of Queensland, was an acclaimed journalist with the BBC and Al Jazeera, who was accused with 3 colleagues of spreading false news and jailed in Egypt. It took over 12 months to get him out and deported back to Australia. Now, in their article, D'Agostino and Grist wrangle with the analogies between the situation of academics and journalists seeking to act with integrity and honour. They also explore the real issue that sometimes academics, despite codes of conduct and professional honour, can fail to act with rigour and integrity. But interestingly, they attribute this to choices made about topics and approaches, which they argue is also limited by the lack of diversity in the academy. And so I start with this observation because when we look at the silencing of academic freedom, it is often when scholars seek to speak truth to power. Truth to power, that old adage popularised by the Quakers, urging people to stand up and confront those in authority who are doing wrong. They were talking of slavery in the United States, and how prescient is that for us today, as in the United States, as well as universities of the colonising and settler societies are confronting not only their legacies of colonisation, but ongoing complicity in colonialism and structural and systemic white supremacy. In Australia, this reckoning with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have fought their way into universities to study, to teach and to research is long overdue. First Nations colleagues report that nearly every day continues to be a struggle with racism, with confronting racism, to bear the load of ongoing attacks upon families and communities, of appalling levels of incarceration and deaths in custody, of intergenerational poverty and ill health, of having to always stand up and fight back. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders also have to carry the burden, the load of expectations that they will teach the rest of us and alert us to respond and to mobilise. It may be agreed that Black Lives Matter, yet how much is this reflected in universities when student and staff retention is not increasing? Universities do not seem to be places of academic freedom to many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. They're still fighting for personal respect and recognition of knowledge systems and for sovereignty These are academic freedom matters. Racism, prejudice, discrimination, and legacies of previous conquests and colonisations are key reasons why scholars are at risk. Researching and teaching and publishing from amongst and for those being denied, often not just a voice, but their livelihood being denied, sometimes their liberty and even their lives. Scholars at Risk, of course, recognises this. In 2018, Turkey's Academics for Peace were awarded the Courage to Think Award, and I quote, for their extraordinary efforts in building academic solidarity and in promoting the principles of academic freedom, freedom of inquiry, and the peaceful exchange of ideas. Academics for Peace had started as a petition protesting the prosecution of the Kurds and the calling for a negotiated space. The consequence was the suspension of staff and even dismissal without pensions. Senior staff who would not cooperate with persecuting the academics were also punished. Students were recruited to spy upon their lecturers. Research grants were stopped. Passports were confiscated. The situation has worsened. Those initial signatories were standing up for the Kurds, knowing full well that a government would also turn even upon mild dissidents. Rael Darwin was the recipient of the Courage to Think Award in 2020. Dr. Darwin was an associate professor in the Human Science Institute and founder of the Minorities Folklore Research Centre in Xinjiang University, and recognised for her work alongside other academics and students of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, who continue to struggle for academic freedom and freedom of opinion, expression, belief, association and movement. She has disappeared. A number of Academics for Peace, though, successfully escaped Turkey with the help of SAR networks. So universities can provide a haven, which they have in the past and continue to do so. But this is violated more and more. Remember last year, probably the year before now, the Hong Kong students who ran from their street protests into their universities and the police that followed and beat them up and arrested them. We were pretty outraged even in mild Australia, or as said before, complacent Australia, a few years ago as armed police burst through a legal picket line over collective agreement negotiations at one of our prominent universities to chase students seeking to speak to the few classes still being held. We have had other incidents in Australia of police coming on to break up or to protect protesters and assemblies, depending upon the whims of their political masters. For academic freedom and freedom of speech are used as weapons by those with power to exercise power. But this does not stop those aspiring to much better, to facilitate conditions that enable students and educators and researchers to take on the hard and the controversial, to seek explanations and answers to what is difficult, to speak that truth to power. It should be remembered that it was in Australia where, even in the last decade, our climate scientists face death threats. Our pioneering feminist and queer researchers and advocates have over decades faced lack of interest and support, often from our local universities, while being applauded overseas. We may not have been jailed for teaching feminism, like an Iranian anthropologist colleague teaching about gender equality. She's also unable to live in her homeland, but at least is safe now thanks to a SAR network. Our hearts, as others have said too, go out to the people of Afghanistan, and particularly in the context of this particular presentation, go out to Afghani women, including the university women who are now probably refused access to university and worse. It's not so dangerous to speak out at Australian universities, but it is unpopular. And it is all the more important, of course, to keep speaking up as colleagues are silenced elsewhere. Now, I'm a trade unionist, and along with academics and journalists, trade unionists are persecuted for speaking uncomfortable truths to those in power. Sam referred to the persecution of teachers and their union in Hong Kong. Education unionists, teachers and academics and researchers and support staff are all targets around the world. Our global trade union centre, Education International, is every day defending educators and advocating our rights. And this is, of course, why participation in and advocacy for SAR is part of our work in the NTU. But the point I want to make here is the conditions of work matter too. Who gets jobs and what sorts of jobs? It's taken many decades for universities to take on those prickly feminists and contemporary gender critical academics. It is in my working memory that an Australian university could have no women professors, where women could not get permanent jobs to get promoted. And even today, too many women academics are blocked at that jump into the professoriate. And that professoriate also does not reflect the multiracial and multicultural diversity of university students, let alone across the country of Australia. Academic careers are hard work and even harder for young aspiring academics, as few can get onto a decent contract from which they can be promoted. As the NTU and other researchers and commentators have continually evidenced, the majority of teaching in Australian universities is done by highly qualified and often very experienced professionals employed sessionally. That means by the hour for a short period of time. It's a piece rate system. You're paid for some activities. Too many of our researchers are on short-term contracts, often for 20 years. Many never get promoted. Others may get all the way to professor and still not get an ongoing job. Why is this an academic freedom issue? And how does this relate to speaking truth to power? Just think about it. A critical, casual academic, even commenting within the subject they are teaching and in which they have a PhD, may find herself labelled difficult and not employed again. And what of the casually employed lecturer who wants to enter into scholarly debate with a professor, unlikely to be asked back? Let alone that tutor that questions why they're not being paid for all the work they do. It is indeed shameful that many of our universities, following union intervention, are now reimbursing staff because of wage theft. And think about the contract researcher that really needs to question the research methodology or the data gathered. What is it's so serious they really need to blow the whistle? Will they still have a career? And what of the courage to take on the wicked problems when the funding for research is so limited and it's wiser to play safe, when university funding is continually squeezed by governments so that universities are told to cut courses, just stick, we are told, with those mainstream courses currently attracting students in which there are clear graduate jobs. That's not going to solve all the wicked problems that were being put to us in universities to try and work out. Is there not an academic freedom issue, and here I am being blatantly political, in doubling the costs for students of undertaking humanities subjects? Compounding this problem, as NTU Vice President, Associate Professor Andrew Bennell pointed out in an article in that same special edition of AUR, academic freedom can also be curtailed as universities go out increasingly desperately looking for other funders because of government funding shortfalls. Of course, highly relevant to the previous comments by Sophie about the reliance of Australian university on the income from international students, particularly Chinese students. And what happens when the corporate or government client or partner wants research that reinforces their preferred position, whether that be in drug trials, gambling policy, or the impacts upon biodiversity of a development proposal? The removal of staff and student elected representatives on university councils, the making the business of these meetings confidential, a constant debate.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I give you a quick wrap up and the hope that we might uncover a little bit more of this in the Q&A?
Yep.
Thank you.
I'm just about to finish by saying democratic decision making is another demonstration of academic freedom. So what we would hope is that we can do better, and indeed there are lots of signs that we will do better as universities are taking on the responsibilities to the broader society, and indeed taking on the big questions of our time, whether it be around climate change or making real commitments to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people and communities. But it does all fall short if students and staff can't stay at university because they cannot pay the fees, need income support, or cannot limp from one casualised session to a short-term contract to no income, but still expect to be grateful. So we can expect more. And then we will be performing academic freedom here at home, which will become even more important when we open back up to international students and to those scholars needing a safe and respectful haven. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeannie, and apologies for my cheeky intervention there. Thanks, Jeannie. You were absolutely right to highlight another dimension of academic freedom, and that is not just the issue of integrity, but also those cultural workplace and employment conditions that are so fundamental at a practical level to ensuring that this freedom is respected in practice. And, you know, obviously, this is a very, very much a live matter in Australia, as we've seen in relation to the matter involving Dr. Peter Ridd. This issue is one we're very alive to, and we'll be all watching eagerly to see what eventuates from the High Court when that matter is decided. Now, I'd like to give another big clap and special thanks to our speakers today, to our panelists, to Sam, to Sophie, and to Jeannie. We're now going to move into this Q&A component of the program. I can see some questions have filtered in, and if you'll bear with me, I'll use my moderator's privilege to distribute them generally around and to encourage a bit of a discussion based upon the key themes that have emerged today. I'd just like to point out to our audience a couple of things. Obviously, Sophie and Sam are not themselves necessarily practicing academics, so coming from a practitioner's perspective on the front line, they may be less in the zone to be speaking about what universities are doing at that governance level. Jeannie, of course, is well equipped to talk to that. I just want to start with highlighting some key themes that have emerged today across the various speakers, both before our panelists and in their respective contributions. One is that we need to all recognise, and I think we have, that the threats to academic freedom are very real for staff and students in Australia, especially as regards resilience from foreign interference and influence, and this issue of institutional integrity and autonomy, this question of what do we really want universities to be and to be doing, and how to do that well. We've also highlighted across the speakers the need for some very practical measures to support academics and staff, and we need to consider the fitness for purpose of institutional settings to meet the scale and the nature of the challenges faced. So, with some of those themes kind of evident in having bubbled up from our speakers today, I'd like to start with a remark raised by Robert French in his perspective earlier, when he raised an important point made in the Her Face statement, which refers to the need for the responsible sharing of academic views without undue constraint. This segues to a question raised by one of our audience about those constraints and about this balancing act that universities face and that we face in public debate more generally. And that is that academic freedom is sometimes used to justify vilification of marginalised people. So we've got this broad freedom that is sought to be ever broader on one hand, and we've got this question on the other hand of how does academic freedom intersect with anti-vilification laws and the need to prevent harm. So this is something which I think all of you will have interesting perspectives on, and I'd invite perhaps Sam to start with the first response.
Thanks, Sophia. Yes, I'm happy to. I think one of the things that has become clearer for me in my role at Amnesty is just the fact that whilst we have many and important human rights, that we find ourselves often in situations where those rights are in direct competition. And at that time where there are competing rights, it's important for us to determine which right prevails, essentially. And we've certainly seen that in the COVID environment around our right to protest and versus our right to be safe, essentially. And you know, academic freedom does not justify discrimination. So it must never outweigh the safety of students, particularly vulnerable and marginalised students. So in that example where we have academic freedom competing against discrimination, it's discrimination that, that needs to be supported.
Thanks, Sam. I might pass over to you, Sophie, from another rights perspective, Human Rights Watch.
Yeah, look, I think what's interesting, apologies, I missed Justice French's speech, but I read his report and I refer to it in my work. And I think the context of which that report was commissioned by the government was because there was a bit of a panic, this idea that there was a freedom of speech crisis on Australian university campuses, which the Justice did establish was not the case. And we've also had the government's, definition of academic freedom this year in the Australian Parliament. So there's been this obsession about freedom of speech being, curtailed in Australian universities because people can't say what they want because they're so, worried about offending people. Whereas in reality, you've got this massive issue of Chinese students and people working on China that was overlooked, we feel, in terms of, the largest number of international students coming, such a over-reliance for Australian universities and their operating budgets on these students, a direct correlation between that issue and the fact that these instances of academic freedom related to Chinese students and academics who teach China have not been addressed. So I feel like there's been, there's the moral panic about what they think has been an issue, and then the reality of this crisis really that has been happening that hasn't received enough attention. So that would, I think, be something that I'd like to highlight. I agree with Sam, of course. Discrimination is never should never be permitted. On a Australian university campus, and we need to do our utmost to ensure that doesn't happen. But at the same time, I think it's been interesting to see how politicized these issues have become in Australia the last few years. And I guess encourage everyone to really look at the research and the facts rather than fall into some of these other debates that we've seen arise.
Thanks, Sophie. And Jeannie, what are your thoughts on this matter of these competing rights and obligations we might face?
Well, I could talk about it in terms of the big picture, and I could talk about it in terms of the day-to-day work in a university. So we do know those who shout loud and have power get platforms. But universities, as many have described today, have a really, really important role in actually also allowing and encouraging and facilitating the debate that we need to have about controversial issues. So we do have a responsibility to create safe environments. So practically, how do we actually do that? So I teach in classrooms which are very diverse. We have a very diverse student population in my university. So how do we start in the Zoom classroom? It's alienating enough as starts. We start with establishing a class consensus. What are the things that we're going to talk about? How are we going to manage difficult questions? How students can respond to what they might find is controversial, they're not sure how to answer it with other students. What sort of things will we set up if people feel perhaps triggered? What do we set up if someone doesn't want to participate in a breakout group with certain other students? We do all that work so that then we can create an environment, because I think our responsibility is to be practical about creating an environment rather than just going no, 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 yes, 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 and responding to, as I said, those with the loudest voices who are the people who have power.
Thanks, Jeannie. That's a really good point to think about those practicalities of what we can be doing. And I'd like us all to come back to this issue of some practical steps. And Sophie, you've obviously got some great recommendations for what universities need to be doing in a very tangible way to be enhancing the safety of students. And we also have a corresponding question from somebody wondering what resources are available for students who need some support. On those points, before we get to the practical steps that we can take, I'd like to see amongst Sophie, Sam and Jeannie, what other key vulnerabilities you think our universities and the university sector are facing. Sophie, you've pointed out our unique exposure to Chinese international students and that commercial driver. I'd like to get to the bottom of a couple of other key vulnerabilities you think we might be facing at this critical moment when we as SAR Australia can develop an agenda for some coordinated responses. Sam, would you like to start?
I'm happy for Sophie to kick this one off.
Sure. I mean, look, we have a very kind of narrow human rights focus at my organisation, but I think I think it's consistency. I think that's one thing we all need to work on, hold our, powers that be to account on. I think that what has been interesting to see in this, debate about foreign interference and China, and how often there have been concerns raised about the Australian university system and how exposed they are. A lot of focus, again, as I mentioned, on national security, research partnerships, dual use technology. But we want to see the government be consistent from all authoritarian governments around the world. So I think, the good work that is done can be undermined when you pick and choose when you want to care about these issues, right? And I think that's partly why Human Rights Watch's work on China, it's good for us to do this research, because we're not part of the China bandwagon that we've seen in the last few years in Australia of people suddenly, waking up and asking these questions. We've spent decades documenting the abuses of the CCP and the, all empowering impact they have on people's lives and the pain that they cause to not only people at home but abroad when people try to escape their control. So I think that's, I guess, would be my one key point I'd like to make at the end, is that we need to ensure that our approach in all of these issues are consistent, because we won't have a leg to stand on if we just like to pick and choose. And I know a lot of people on the panel today have a history of working across all different countries and particular topics, but that's not always the case, and we've seen that as well with our universities, when they like to pick and choose when to care about academic freedom. So I think that's probably what my comment on that one, Sophia.
Super. Thanks, Sophie. Now, Jeannie, as an academic, you probably have a couple of broader insights as well about what the key vulnerabilities are of our universities and the university sector are to being able to realise academic freedom and really defend it. What do you think the key vulnerabilities are of the university sector?
I'd have to say, I think that the key one is the lack of government funding to our universities and the continual contraction of government funding, which of course is behind the racing for treating international students as a cash cow, as the term that has been used, and thus leading to many of the problems that Sophie's talking to in terms of the response of our universities to the investigation and findings of the Human Rights Watch report. So we have very low funding as an OECD, as a rich country. So I think that should be the starting point to thinking about. If we care, and if there's expressed care, if we have in the Higher Education Act academic freedom clauses, they need to be backed up with the funding so that the universities can actually exercise some of those things within those clauses that Robert French read out to us. The other one, I think, is very much the fragility of staff due to being employed casually and on short-term contracts. The capacity to exercise academic freedom in their own work, in their colleagues' work, in support of their students' work, and in, of course, participating in the university, which again is part of the Act now, that staff students should be able to participate in the university. Yet what opportunity do you have to do that when you're employed for 3 months at a time for a few hours a week?
Thanks, Jeannie. That's and thank you all. Those are some really good points. Now, look, we've had some really inspirational points. That our work here in supporting academic freedom is about buffering against the fragility of human life and advancing the quest for knowledge. That it's vital to democracy. That it's vital to the survival of public intellectualism and public debate, as well as to the very safety of individuals and their employment. But let's start thinking about some practical things that we can be doing. If we're thinking about building an agenda for scholars at risk in Australia, our new section, I'd really like to get a handle on what you think our practical agenda ought to be as those who are at the forefront of defending human rights and mobilising for human rights. What would you like to see us do? I might start with Sam or Sophie or whoever would like to nominate first.
Sure, I'm happy to kick this off. I think in the comments that we've just heard around vulnerability are particularly relevant at this moment in time. So we almost have a global vulnerability associated with COVID-19. And what we have seen is that many governments across the world have taken advantage of the opportunity to abuse powers. And you know, of course, we're seeing this play out very visually at the moment in Afghanistan, but there is a significant risk of what is occurring in relation to the Taliban having an inspirational effect on other authoritarian regimes across the world, and seeing seeing further situations like this. So I think it's an interesting moment in time where, as a global community, we have enormous pockets of vulnerability. As I mentioned earlier, I think Australia has a significant responsibility in this, in really holding governments to account, in leaning on our own government to take action and to use their power wisely and sensibly. We've obviously been working with the Australian government for many months now to safely bring home academics and scholars and allies, interpreters and journalists in Afghanistan, and of course have increased that pressure more recently with advocacy to the Prime Minister and Minister Payne in the shadows. But you know, as I mentioned earlier in the plenary, essentially people are powerful when we stand together. So there's a real opportunity for us to have a look at what are the actions that we need to take across university campuses across Australia in a united way, but also in discrete and individual ways. But certainly we can't underestimate the power of people coming together, whether that's letter writing, whether that's petition signing, whether it's talking to your local member, but really escalating the conversation and being united wherever possible so that we amplify our voices.
Sophie, do you have a point of view you'd like to add, or Jeannie?
Go on, Sophie.
Oh, I mean, I think, look, I think there's going to be an opportunity in the next few months when the government puts out their report on threats to Australian universities. We've seen that parliamentary inquiry take place over the last few months, and we know that there is, some strong recommendations that will come out there. And I'm hoping that our work will have been influential in shifting that debate from a narrow national security lens to a human rights focus. One thing is that I would like the universities to lead on these issues. I think we've seen some response to our report was from universities saying, oh, we need, more support from the intelligence agencies. This is their remit to cover these issues that have been raised in the report. But what we find is that, a lot of these threats to academic freedom that we documented, they don't meet the threshold of criminal behaviour. They're not being carried out by official state actors. So this is why it's falling through the cracks, because, the universities are shifting it to the security agencies. The agencies are saying, look, we've got real criminal behaviour that we're busy with. We don't have time for this kind of thing. So we want to see leadership from the sector, because I think if the sector doesn't lead on this, the government will impose regulation. We know universities are feeling over-regulated at the moment, and they're struggling massively with budget cuts because of government funding and that decline in international students. So unless the sector really embraces this issue and leads on it itself, then, what the government imposes might not be what is ideal, right? So I think that's why we're really hoping that vice chancellors and deputy vice chancellors working in the international student sector, really embrace these issues and recognise that this is a serious, threat to our democracy, and these issues of academic freedom are not just kind of a side issue. It's central to how our universities operate. The very safety of students and staff and their ability to speak freely about issues really couldn't be more important for an Australian university to consider these issues. So that's what I'm hoping we're going to see over the next few months, is to see some of these issues prioritised and really some strong leadership.
Thanks, Sophie. And I might just hand it over to Jeannie for some concluding remarks before we wrap up this session.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, I think let's go back to what was being talked about earlier about democracy and the role of universities in democracy. So we have a massive responsibility, was my take out from that, those of us who are in universities in whatever capacity that may be. and indeed our broader communities attached to our universities. So we do have a big responsibility in this. So I think it's two-pronged, Sophia. It's both what we're doing internally, what we are doing about creating safe and strong places for having difficult discussions, for having debates, for giving students and staff the opportunity to be part of those, whether they be just at an assembly called for whatever reason to talk about an issue, whether it be through the governance bodies of the universities. So we do want to see our universities actually take a stand on things where they've been reluctant to, for all the reasons we've all been talking about. But also, I think, got out of practice a bit too. Because I think one of the things that's been forgotten, sometimes even by our university leaders, is how powerful they actually are. And the power of our universities is immense. And so when we do come together as universities, and indeed the leaders of our universities, and take a stand, it can make a really big difference. And if we've done that work within our universities, and a university leader is standing up knowing they also have the support from across their universities, this can make a difference. It is about the power of people that Sam was talking about. So I think there is a lot can be done, but I think that tie that we have as universities a massive responsibility. And that it's expected of our communities. What I always constantly reminded of in the immediate community of my university is how much our community expects of us and respects us for it. And that's why they want to be part of the university. And isn't that what we're after? And these are people from all parts of the world with many, many stories and many experiences, which are pretty tough as we're going through the times we're going through now. So I think democracy and standing up and being counted.
What a great way to end. I think those final remarks from each of you have been really spot on in doing really a good evaluation and a status check and a health check of where we're at and where we would like to go. And I think that's a really healthy set of final contributions from each of you. So I'd really like to give a big, big thank you to Sam, to Sophie, and to Jeannie, and to thank our audience as well, who've been very indulgent in going a little bit over the timeline. And just finally, a very, very big thank you on behalf of USC, on behalf of those of us who've been working to bring this launch to fruition. I really want to thank you, each and every one of you, for championing this cause and for championing those values that are so important to this cause itself, whether those be the values of democracy, of fundamental freedoms, and of human rights. So thank you so much. And over to you, Joyce, back at SAR at NYU.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and thank you to all of our panelists. And just before we close, I want to quickly thank everyone who spoke here today, the University of the Sunshine Coast for convening all of us and serving as lead for the SAR Australia section, and to all of our universities. I'd like to also offer a special thank you to Dr. Eva Marie Cito from the University of the Sunshine Coast. She has been truly a driving force behind the creation of this section for quite some time, and we're so deeply appreciative of her efforts. For those who are new to the network, there are several ways that you can get involved and assist in the work that SAR and the SAR Australia section are engaged in. That includes joining the network, signing up for our email list so that you can get all of our updates, engaging in our student advocacy seminars and legal clinics. So we have opportunities across the board for faculty and for students. For those of you who are watching the tragic events unfolding in Afghanistan currently, I want to make a special plea to our universities to consider hosting a scholar from Afghanistan. As Rob Quinn noted, we have received an influx of applications, and we expect that number to grow in the coming weeks. So we have already seen quite a bit of support from the network, from our universities stepping up and standing in solidarity with their colleagues from Afghanistan who are willing to host and welcome them to their campuses. And we are here to guide you through that process and to share more on that. So please write into our email address that's available on our website. If you know a scholar who is in distress in Afghanistan in the current situation, or anywhere else around the world, please share our encrypted application. It is online at scholarsatrisk.gethelp.org. You can go straight to our website, and it's one of the first things you see when you get there. Please share that link. The scholar can apply that way, and we will vet their application and be in touch with them. Thank you all again for joining us. We are absolutely delighted to be working with our colleagues here, and I think there's plenty to be done, but there's a lot of passion and strength, and we are just very lucky to be part of this inspiring group. Thank you all, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Joyce, and well done. We'll see you around sometime.